Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Council. On behalf of the Atlantic Council's President and CEO, Fred Kemp, I'm Barry Pavel. I'm Vice President and Director of the Brent Scowcroft Center here on International Security. I'm really glad to see you here today, and this is going to be a really interesting and important conversation on the inner workings of ISIS. We're joined by three really fantastic and diverse panelists, whom I'll introduce in a second. Maybe I'll just give you the one-liners, and I want to get to the conversation as quickly as possible. We have Michael Weiss here, who's a distinguished author, alongside Hassan of the book ISIS Inside the Army of Terror, and he's also senior editor at the Daily Beast. It's a really good book. It gives you a lot of the history and really inside scoop on how this came to be and what's really happening. Martin Chulov, who I met for the first time in the green room, is extremely impressive. He's a reporter for The Guardian based in Beirut, where he covers in very great detail the Syrian civil war and ISIS, including talking to a lot of ISIS commanders as they're coming in and out from the combat zone. And we also are really honored to have Jade Parker here. She's a senior research associate at Tapestry, where she covers non-state actor cybersecurity and cyber warfare capabilities. I think the cyber element of this really tends to get underplayed, certainly here in Washington. And Jade also is talking to ISIS commanders and other members of the group online in various ways. And so I think we'll get some really un-Washington-like insights from this panel here, where we'll have some really direct and raw access to what's really happening here. This isn't a random event. The Scowcroft Center and the Atlantic Council more broadly are doing a lot of work on this, as many of you may know. In the Scowcroft Center, we did a series of war games on ISIS, including a red team, including a lot of current officials, either playing roles or as observers. I really learned a lot from those, and you can too if you look online at our issue briefs. And obviously at the Hariri Center here, many of you may know of the very significant effort led by Steve Hadley and Madeleine Albright on developing a collective strategy, collective meaning not a U.S. strategy only that we throw to the region, but a collective strategy among the U.S. and its European and Middle Eastern allies and partners for dealing with the region's challenges and opportunities on a long-term basis, as well as dealing with shorter-term, very significant challenges, and much more to come on that as it further develops. I think the questions regarding ISIS don't need a lot of introduction or prologue. Suffice to say, there has been some success on the ground recently by the coalition, rolling back some of ISIS's territorial gains, I think, in my own view, with the newfound operational tempo since the Paris attacks and somewhat released rules of engagement. But there's a long way to go. And obviously getting to the root causes is more than just rolling back territorial gains. It also has to involve ideological appeal, which to me is the long pole in the tent. Its global reach via Twitter and other social media, which Jade will give us great detail on. Some have called for the need for a digital counterinsurgency in order to also stem the group's appeal and a number of other areas. So the idea here is really to try to get to some really granular understanding and insights, not from sort of commentators here in Washington, but from people who are really knee-deep in the details of the inner workings of ISIS and what we might expect coming next. So I think with that, I'm going to welcome our panelists onto the stage and continue the conversation. And I really do want this to be a conversation. We're going to avoid stiltedness and talking points. We'll start here, but then we really want to open it up to you as well. There's so much to talk about, and just from the earlier discussion in the green room, there's really just a lot of interesting and important things to address. I might start with Martin, who at his base in Lebanon has had, sounds like, numerous discussions with senior ISIS commanders and others. And Martin, would just love to get your observations on sort of what are you hearing, what are you seeing perhaps coming next as well. And thanks again for coming.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you for having me. This is working?
Yeah.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be in Washington, and I appreciate the opportunity to join this discussion. As Barry said, I'm the Middle East correspondent for The Guardian. I've been in the region for the last 11 years now, and throughout that time we've made it central to the way that we report to be not just on front lines per se, sorry to use that cliche, but to be amongst the communities themselves. And over the last 3 years, with the rise of this phenomenon we now know as the Islamic State, that has meant a lot of reporting time inside of Syria, inside of Iraq, and increasingly in Turkey and also Lebanon, all of these areas where ISIS and its global agenda are very evident. And as part of that, I've had a lot of conversations with various members of this organisation. Sometimes they're foot soldiers who come and go. Sometimes they're opposition types who have danced with the devil on the other side, then come back. But in a couple of cases, they are senior members, and one in particular I've met with over the last 3 years now consistently. He gets himself out of Iraq and Syria to come and see me in a neighbouring country. And throughout the series of conversations I've had with him, I've seen a fundamental change in the narrative of ISIS. And I wanted to start the conversation by talking about that briefly. So the guy that I've spoken to is senior enough to be on the military council, which puts him in the top 12 in the organisation. He was somebody who was back in 2003, in his early 20s, he was swept up by the anti-American insurgency that started. He became a loyalist of Zarqawi. He was sent to the American prison system in southern Iraq called Camp Bucca, which by then had evolved out of the infamy of Abu Ghraib to be a more classically run detention centre. My guy was there with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of the organisation. At that time, Baghdadi was a reasonably low-level cleric. He was somebody who was, in my guy's words, quiet, sinister, capable, manipulative, was always plotting something, but back then in the deserts of southern Iraq, he did not know that he would end up being the most wanted person in the world today. He gave me quite intimate detail of how that prison system gave ISIS the capacity to organise in ways that they couldn't have done. And this is an earlier incarnation of the group we now know as ISIS. It was Islamic State back then, but the goals, the ideals, the objectives were all pretty much the same. He says that 2 years that they had in 2004 and 5 in particular gave them a capacity that they would use on the streets of Iraq in 2006 up through till about 2010 when the more or less the insurgency had subsided. But the most important moment for them was the Syrian war next door, which gave them an opportunity for the ambitions which had been quelled in Iraq, more or less, to be re-amplified again. And all throughout this trajectory, my guy has said that the people who were central to the Camp Bucca prison system in the early days continued to rise through it, took up prominent positions inside of Syria, and were absolutely central to turning the Islamic State project, as it was back then, into the juggernaut that we now know it. That's been very central to the discussions that we've had, but over the last couple of years, I have noticed, I guess, a change in the tone of the person that I speak to. He was a young firebrand ideologue in the old days. He was somebody who was swept up by the we are Sunnis of this country. We have been usurped by the American invasion. We've lost all status, we've lost all privileges, and we've lost all dignity. So he became a fervent believer, underpinned by his religious beliefs in getting rid of the American occupation. That then morphed into fighting the Shias, which had been the beneficiaries of the invasion, according to him. But as he's gotten older, as he's grown up and he's dealt with some real life issues, you've started to see the essence of, a real human decision-making process going on there. For example, this guy's now in his mid to late 30s, as I say, very, very senior, still a lieutenant of Baghdadi, but his mother had died. His wife had had a young child, things such as this. He'd begun to question his faith, but he could not move away from this organisation because he was forced to swear allegiance to Baghdadi. He knows that if he did try and leave, he would be killed, so would all of his family members. And he says to me that there are at least a half dozen people on the leadership committee, the Shura Council of ISIS, who all feel the same way. And this has happened over the last year in particular, where there have been some significant tactical battlefield victories in terms of the air campaign, which has been very efficient in many ways, in terms of denying, in terms of taking territory off ISIS in northern Iraq and parts of eastern Syria. But beyond that, he's come to totally disavow what he sees as the current ISIS agenda, and that is spoken quite openly within the organisation itself, and that is to do its best to export the chaos to Europe and the US in particular. He says that the senior leaders now don't necessarily believe that they need to hang on to this swathe of land that they control from the eastern edge of Aleppo right through to Mosul. That's not so important. What is important is that this base is used to export chaos far beyond, and the thinking is that by getting a cell structure up and running in Europe and elsewhere, that the organisation's goals will be fulfilled by osmosis. So that's where they are, according to him. He and others, senior leaders, don't believe that this is going to do anything other than, bring on a fight that they can no longer control. He disavows it, but he feels as though he can't do much about it. He's particularly worried about how precise the airstrikes are. They are very worried about infiltration now. There have been far more successful efforts to get inside the minds and inside the technical capabilities of the organisation than there ever had been. I guess I'll just leave it there for now.
Thanks. Michael, I want to turn to you next. You've written what I consider to be one of the best, if not the best book on ISIS, and I strongly commend people to buy it. And I know you're coming out with an updated copy soon, so maybe they can wait a couple weeks. But one thing Martin said really struck me, and I've had this discussion with U.S. and other officials. How important is the land? How important is them holding territory sort of for their continuing appeal and recruitment and resources? I mean, with territory comes oil facilities and other things and other forms, taxation, other ways they get revenue. So if you can answer that question, but also based on your book, sort of give the audience here some sense of the history, sort of contextualize this conversation to assess ISIS's rise from its origins in Iraq to what's going on now, and do all that in 4 minutes.
Well, I shall try. I think what's interesting is, like a lot of analysts who are approaching this phenomenon as of June of 2014, when they stormed into Mosul, the United States and Western officialdom had kind of condescended toward this notion of the Islamic State. This is not a state, as President Obama said. This is a mafia. This is a jumped-up insurgency. And I think while it's certainly true in the mid-2000 period, under Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the founder of al-Qaeda in Iraq, that essentially these guys, they were mostly native Iraqis. This is a huge misconception. The Bush administration had claimed that these were all foreign fighters. This was all an al-Qaeda-led insurgency. Al-Qaeda was the tip of the spear, and the reason that they managed to take over essentially the anti-American campaign or absorb most of the high-profile commanders and battlefield infantrymen into their ranks is because they succeeded. I mean, they were the ones waging the most spectacular attacks. They had a very sophisticated media apparatus that grew increasingly sophisticated over time. A lot of the things we see today that have become part of the kit of ISIS, such as the dressing of the captives in the orange Guantanamo Bay-style jumpsuits, this was patented by Zarqawi. The exhibition of atrocities which is something very difficult for a Western imagination to wrap its head around, including State Department campaigns to try and counter the ISIS messaging. You talk to state officials and they say, look, what can we do to show the pornographic, grotesque appeal or grotesque aspects of this organization when they're out there on Twitter showing the beheadings and the crucifixions and reveling in it. But what struck me the most, and like Martin, I've had some sources within the organization, by no means as high level as his. I went to Turkey in October and I interviewed a defector from not just the kind of rank and file cadres, but ISIS has 4 security branches. Again, the pretensions of statehood are quite prominent. These branches are modeled on regional mukhabarat services, such as the Saddam Hussein regimes. It's no coincidence that a lot of the guys in the senior echelons of the organization are former Baathists or military commanders, or more prominently so, military intelligence and just intelligence officers from the Saddamist Baath regime. This guy, however, was not. He was a native Syrian, had fought in the Syrian Arab Army, actually lived in Europe for a spell, came back to Syria in 2011 or early 2012, and I had known him over time because I've done a lot of reporting at the border, and I was in Aleppo in 2012 when what was then the Free Syrian Army took a town called Al-Bab, which is now one of the two main centers in Aleppo province, still controlled by ISIS. And this guy had joined ISIS, he said, because when he saw the coalition assembled to only go after the Takfiri Sunni extremists, but to do nothing to address the Assad war machine, or what has now become essentially an Iranian suzerainty. I mean, it is very much couched in this sectarian existential conflict between Sunni and Shia. Shia represented by Iran and its Revolutionary Guard Corps, and now backed by a consortium of these militia groups that have been built in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iran, even taking Afghan refugees who have gone to Iran from fleeing the Taliban. Anyway, he told me, look, this does function like a state in many respects. They have health administrative services. They have these security branches which conduct intelligence but also counterintelligence, weeding out spies and infiltrators. He said, how do you think ISIS took so much territory? And I said, well, they fight really well, right? Abu Umar al-Shishani, the great sort of Georgian Chechen warrior who's been sensationalized in the media as this battlefield commander trained by the United States to fight in the Georgian-Russian War of 2008, he said, no, all of that's just nonsense. He's like, they fight like lemmings going off a cliff. And he knows because he trained a lot of these guys up. He said, the reason they're able to take such territory is there's 2. Number 1, there's a kind of anthropological quality. ISIS bills itself as the custodian and defender of Sunni Islam, full stop. And in the beginning, in 2004, Zarqawi's apocalyptic vision, Iraq is a Shia majority country which had been led by a Sunni minority totalitarian regime. As Martin said, when the Americans came in and overthrew Saddam, this just automatically enfranchised the Shia, and they became the inheritors of the state through the democratic process and the not so democratic process. But Zarqawi's goal was a sort of demography is destiny kind of game, end game, as he was a sort of pathological, messianic, apocalyptic lunatic. And it was to go after the Shia such that they will radicalize. Iran will rush to their aid. They will form these militia groups, which will then wage pogroms against the Sunnis, thus driving the Sunnis into the fold of AQI. Well, ISIS has taken up the cudgel and then some. And they have been bolstered in many respects through what you might call the accident of geopolitics in the last decade. The Sunnis of the region, and I've seen this metamorphosis from 2011 until now, it started with, well, why doesn't the United States come and give us a no-fly zone or intervened against Assad? I mean, he's done worse than Mubarak, he's done worse than Gaddafi, and what's the logic? Oh, it's to protect Israel and keep the Golan quiet because, the regime and the Israelis have had this compact for 40 years. Then it became, no, Obama wants to do a nuclear deal with the Iranians and he doesn't want to jeopardize that, so he doesn't want to upset Iranian equities in Syria. Now, a lot of people on the ground, by no means jihadi ideologues, by no means brainwashed by the ISIS ideology, truly believe the United States is in it for the dispossession and marginalization of the Sunni majority of the Middle East. And this is the most dangerous sociological or anthropological appeal that ISIS has. Because again, we're almost doing their propaganda for them. This is something that U.S. policy, I think, still has not adequately appreciated. And, I mean, let us be honest, certain maneuvers or certain policies undertaken or certain comments made by high-level U.S. officials only tend to bolster that case. I mean, when Obama gives an interview to Jeffrey Goldberg and say, well, you know, the Iranians at least let their women drive, but the Saudis are the real bad apple in the region, Sunnis hear that as essentially an anti-Sunni dog whistle. This feeds into the ISIS ideology. So they have this very clever appeal on the ground. One of the things, the main bulwark of their propaganda is to try and forestall another awakening. So for those of you who don't know, you mostly do, I'm sure, in 2005 to 2008, it started at a very local level, but what happened was Sunni tribal Arabs started rising up against AQI's dominance in their villages or cities or towns. And they started rising up not because they had any love for the American-led occupation, quite the contrary. They rose up because AQI was behaving as we know them to behave, as barbaric mass murderers. They were raping the women of tribal elders, they were assassinating the sheikhs, and perhaps most importantly, they were stealing so much of the wealth that had enriched this community. I mean, the tribes of western central Iraq and eastern Syria, and the so-called Jazeera, they have been the classic horse traders of the region for hundreds of years. They work with whoever is seen to be the powerful actor on the ground, whether it's Saddam in Iraq, whether it's AQI, or it's Assad, or it's the FSA, or some Islamist group, or now ISIS. These guys rose up at a local level, partnered with the Americans, because at least the Americans didn't conduct ethnic cleansing campaigns when they were liberated from the terrorists, unlike the Iraqi government and these Shia militia groups which had increasingly become paramilitary arms of the Iraqi state. So ISIS has appreciated the lessons of the awakening, the gains of which were solidified by the Petraeus surge, to an extent that we, I think, have almost forgotten those lessons, right? If you look at their propaganda, there's a series of videos they put out called The Clanging of the Swords. And it's like a demented version of the series Cops on Fox, the Fox channel. They kind of go house to house, dressed as Iraqi security officers, knocking on the doors of the Sunni sheikhs who had joined the awakening councils, partnered with the Iraqi government and the Americans. And the sheikhs open the door thinking it's somebody from Baghdad, and they're interrogated on camera. And ISIS makes them confess to being collaborators of the great Rafida infidel, Zionist conspiracy, and the rest. Then these guys their sons are made to dig a mass grave somewhere in Iraq, and then the sons and the father is beheaded and their bodies dumped in the mass grave. This image is juxtaposed to an image of what they call mass repentance rallies. If you were a Sunni and you partnered with the Shia, or the Iranians and the Americans, if you come to us and you beg forgiveness, if you tear up your government ID badge and turn in your Kalashnikov, all will be forgiven. You pledge undying allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and we welcome you into the Ummah. If you don't, see Exhibit A, right? So it's this carrot and stick approach. Very powerful. The other aspect of their state-building mechanism is tradecraft. They're very, very good at intelligence and counterintelligence. So I mentioned, that a lot of these guys came from Saddam's regime. There was a great piece by Martin and my mutual friend Christoph Reuter in Der Spiegel, who actually obtained ISIS documents that had belonged to a guy called Haji Bakr. Haji Bakr was a former, I think he was a lieutenant or colonel actually in Saddam's Air Force Defense Intelligence Unit, which is one of the elite Mukhabarat services. And the documents show this very elaborate, almost a honeycomb network of spies, informants, paid operatives, people who were gathering information on local communities. If the sheikh who ran some village or who ran some area in Syria, if one of his sons was secretly a homosexual, they'd get this information and they'd extort the family. You must pledge allegiance to ISIS or we'll expose your son and then we'll kill him and your shame will befall your family. They use money. They bribe their way in. This defector who in the Daily Beast I call Abu Khalid told me ISIS will send emissaries pretending to be potential recruits for some Free Syrian Army faction. And they'll equip him with $200,000 cash. And he'll join at the lower level, the lower cadre of the brigade or the battalion. And over time, because he's wealthy and because he can buy his way up, he'll work his way into a commanding role. Then he will control essentially a fifth column in some rebel-held territory, such that when ISIS invades the territory, it already belongs to ISIS. They don't have to do much fighting. The community has given itself over to the organization. You mentioned their means of self-enrichment. I think there's a bit of a misconception. It is definitely true that the hydrocarbon industry is a main driver of the ISIS economy, but it's by no means the largest. And we know this because leaked documents from their apparatus in Deir Zor show that they make more money through taxation and the sort of surcharge, the bureaucratic surcharge economy. If you're seen to be committing some crime or sin according to ISIS Sharia, not only will you be put in jail or in some cage, but you'll be charged. You'll have to pay a fine. If you were working for an opposition group or seen to be working for the regime, you'll have to vacate your property, presuming you haven't killed you already, or if you run away, they'll take hold of your property, your assets, all of your money, and basically this is where the mafia component comes into play. So this is why they want land. I mean, land is, it's power projection, right? We are a state. Look at the swath of territory we control, the size of Great Britain, as even your infidel politicians will admit. But it's also because with more land comes more people, and with more people comes more money. And so when we talk about what does ISIS control, to some extent, the geography matters less than the population. And it's true. I mean, when they have cities, they have population centers. Mosul, formerly, well, to some extent still Fallujah, formerly Ramadi, Raqqa. But even the countryside, I mean, you do have families and farmsteads and agricultural economies. And this is very important to them. So ISIS is ruling millions of people. And every single day, millions of people are giving money to ISIS. And I'll end on one note. It is true the coalition has had some market success through airstrikes and also through ground proxies, particularly in northern Syria. But there have been unintended consequences of this war, as there always are. One of the unintended consequences, as my colleague and co-author Hassan has pointed out, is that a lot of people who cannot leave, who cannot join this mass migration wave into Turkey and then, inshallah, into Europe or the United States, have joined ISIS because of dire straits. Their means of subsistence, their means of making a living have been literally bombed by the coalition warplanes. And so ISIS at least will offer you whatever the going rate is now, $400 a month plus, I mean, they run a welfare state, a subsidy for your wife, your parents, your children, pay for your health care. If you have cancer and you can't get treatment inside Syria or in Iraq, they'll actually send you into Turkey to go to hospital and get chemotherapy if you're a paid-up member of the ISIS rank and file. So this kind of social outreach program, very much replicating what Hezbollah has done in Lebanon, other organizations in the region have done, I think is really the main driver behind why they still have popular appeal in spite of their battlefield losses and also in spite of their gruesome brutality.
Thanks a lot, Michael. I'll come back to you on a lot of those things. Jade, I want to turn to you now, and you have perhaps the best sense of what they're doing online. You talk to them daily, it sounds like?
I talk to them about 18 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Okay, that's a lot. How do you do this? What are they doing? What are they thinking? And what are the trends that you're seeing? How are things evolving online, which to me is at least as important as in the real world, in the physical world?
So I do infiltration and exploitation operations within all of ISIS cyber domain. But the three areas that I have, I guess, the most exposure and the most activity in is their online social media attacks, like their offensive, their information security, which is, their defensive, and then also their hacking groups. I guess it's a little bit difficult to say, where are they going to go from here? Because, they have one setback, they'll try to get around it. One of the things that I was really pleased to see is that right now Facebook and Twitter have really been taking a lot harder measures. And I'm not saying, they're really quick to, delete things. But it's much more difficult to hack into Facebook now for these guys than it was before, because I know the ways that they hack into these accounts. And whereas they used to be able just to do it, and it was no problem, like we're going to go in, we're going to deface this, and it took about 15 minutes. Now it's taking them a little bit more than a half an hour to do it, because you find an account and then Facebook will have locked it, right? So then you have to know what the person's birthday is, or you have to provide official, ID. And this wasn't really happening before, and this is really, there's been a huge uptick in the last couple of weeks, which I was, really glad to see, although it was a little bit frustrating because, like I said, these are kinds of things that I, do every day. So, you know, it was kind of like a win on one side, and then I was like, oh, now I've got to go find like other things to do. I guess when it comes to propaganda, I think that some people have the wrong idea. You know, they do put out a lot of videos, they put a lot of pictures, you know, all over social media, and people say, oh, this is how people are becoming radicalized. This is what is bringing them over to ISIS. In my experience, that's not true. That definitely appeals to people who are really into that atrocity porn. You know, it'll get their attention. It's like when we go to the grocery store and we see an advertisement. You know, I see this toothpaste ad. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to buy it, but maybe I'll look into it, right? Because I need toothpaste, looks good, why not? How they're really getting people, in my opinion, is these guys aren't difficult to access, right? You see a million of these fanboys all over Twitter, all over Facebook, all over Tumblr. Wherever you go, you can't really get away from them. And you can start talking to them, right? So you start talking to the fanboys, you know, they start talking to you, you develop friendships. Then maybe you'll start talking to somebody at a little higher level. And then maybe you'll start talking to somebody who's actually a confirmed member of, you know, ISIS in their cyber domain. And, you know, whereas some of these guys, you know, they can't talk to their families about kind of some of the hardships they're going through, or the fact that they are leaning towards these kinds of ideologies. So they feel isolated. So where do you turn? You turn to one of your friends in the cyber caliphate, right? And because they're all over the world, they can access them at any time, in the morning, at night, doesn't matter where you are, there's always somebody up. And every time they put out a video, it's more like we're rallying behind, like, look what we did, right? Like, you know, and to me, that's much more effective in recruiting people than, you know, okay, we're going to put out a video. Well, okay, sure, the State Department can put out, you know, as many tweets as they want, you know, addressing specific accounts. Fine. I mean, they're likely just going to ignore it. You know, because we don't have people who are talking to them and trying to talk them out of it. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not saying that they would necessarily listen. Like, they're not really that you know, the average recruit to middle management, sure, you know, they know the Quran, but they're also very selective about what they're going to believe in the Quran. Although don't tell them that, because then they'll just, you know, tell you that you're an infidel, and then you're a spy and all these things. And it doesn't really do much good. So I don't know how we combat that. But, I mean, I guess in the future, I'd like to say that, oh, they're going to get fewer recruits. But I don't think that's true. I think they're going to get lower quality recruits, which is what they're doing now, including in their cyber. I mean, in their specifically like hacking cyber little groups, because they're pulling people off the battlefield to put them in the cyber domain. And some of these guys, you know, are battle-hardened mujahideen who have somehow been separated from their groups in Iraq or Syria. Now they're in another country, and they say, okay, now what, right? So some of their higher-ups say, now you go into cyber. Now you learn how to do some hacking, right? And as a result, they've set up this kind of informal mentorship program, right? So I have a mentor within ISIS. I also have mentees. I'm mentoring people, you know, which is kind of a strange situation to find yourself in. Some of these guys really have significant, very sophisticated technological skill. You know, they'll have sheets of credentials with Microsoft, Cisco. Some of them really know what they're doing. The vast, vast majority have no idea. Or they think it's a good idea, like it sounds cool, you get to wear a black hoodie, like you're gonna go in and you're gonna like hack the world, right? No. I mean, the vast majority of the people who even get to middle management, or even just into these groups, right? Because it's very difficult to get into these groups. Most of them have less than 20 people in these little groups. You can only get in if you are respected based on actionable skills and actual hacking that you can confirm that you carried out, and based on trust. And sometimes they'll throw you a curveball, because they'll say, okay, hack this. But of course, they don't want spies in their organization. So, you know, you can hack something, and they'll say, okay, yeah, but now hack this other thing, right? Because, you know, if you select a target, who knows that you didn't create that target to knock it down, right? So they'll say, okay, that's great, now do this. And they're constantly testing you, right? So they will send you a link, and if you are not in a VM, a virtual machine, and you click that link, they will try to grab your IP. You know, everybody's constantly trying to figure out who everybody else is, particularly the people who actually know what they're doing on the computer. And the vast majority, like, they don't care who they are, right? If these guys are just supporters or fanboys, the hardcore hackers are not going to bother with them because it doesn't really matter. The people that they are worried about are the people kind of like at my level and their level, trying to figure out who you are. Are you a spy? You know, and it takes a while to, first you have to go through their counterintelligence, right? And then from there, you're constantly just being tested. So I would anticipate in the future, I guess, like I said, more people, but less quality. I mean, some of these guys who actually are in middle management in these hacking collectives, some of them actually are the top, you know, the higher level of the newer hacking collectives. You know, they've been doing this stuff for less than a year and a half, right? So before that, they had no programming experience at all. But they spend all day, every day, trying to learn, you know, how do I use Kali? How do I use, you know, other programming languages more effectively? And so you're likely to see a lot more, you know, database breaches, leaking of personally identifiable information, cross-site scripting, you know, when they deface websites, because they're gaining more people, but beyond that, they have high aspirations. Like they say, okay, you know, we'd really like to hack the cables underneath the Mediterranean Red Seas. Do I believe that they can do this? No. No, I don't. Do I think they can hack an electrical grid? No, I don't. Do I think they really want to hack an electrical grid? Not really. Because it doesn't align with what they're trying to do. Because right now, they're trying to get more hackers. So if you can hack an electrical grid, but you can't put out your little, you know, image and say, you know, this was done by the cyber caliphate, or this was, you know, it doesn't work as well compared to, you know, hacking 100 different Facebook accounts and putting, you know, all your images all over the place and then spreading them around. This is much more effective for them. Do I think that they could probably hack a hospital or sewage treatment and insert, you know, ransomware? Yeah, I do. I think some of these guys would do that.
So you're saying we might start seeing a little more activity. It's not going to be a broad-scale set of cyber attacks, but we might start seeing a little more activity here and there, right, from what sounds like a growing capacity to do sort of small-scale cyber disruptions or attacks.
Right.
Okay, that's really interesting. I want to ask one more general question, and then we'll open it up a little bit. And the general question, just taking all of everything you all said in, and it was a lot, is let's put this in context in both time and space. We have a lot going on in the region. It seems like new headlines every day. We have a cessation of hostilities in Syria. How is that affecting your thoughts and the calculus of the leadership of this group? We have the Saudis being much more active, forming an alliance, at least, and having an exercise. It's pretty broad scale, about 20 countries, I think. The U.S. still sort of a perception of a relative, you know, still conducting operations, but a perception that the U.S. isn't really there for some reason or other. That's just the perception that I'm hearing from leaders in the region. We have a flow of refugees that in many ways to Europe, that's historic, and I'm hearing that over the summer it's going to grow pretty significantly. In the next few months, Europe is sort of bracing itself. I'm just back from Europe as well. And we have a U.S. presidential election that, at least in terms of the ideological space, has to be, you know, having some impact already, I think, in terms of the rhetoric and the support that rhetoric seems to be getting. So what's your sense of sort of where things, and I didn't even mention Libya, which seems to be getting more attention, and from what I can tell, for good reason. But so how is all of this affecting sort of your sense of the dynamics of the organization and what they may do next and sort of where they're headed? And I just want to throw that out and start a conversation on that.
Well, I think, I mean, Michael spoke about some of the key drivers for us as why they're continuing to do relatively well, given how hard they're being hit tactically. And I want to make the point that while they are taking some tactical defeats, I don't think that they're taking strategic defeats. What they are doing is they are positioning themselves as an organisation that can restore the lost glories of Islam. That's on one hand. The second thing is they are saying to young disenfranchised Sunnis of the region and of the world that you are part of a generation that is privileged to be part of this project. The third thing, and the most important thing, is they are able to say that in the absence of a a political system, and let's be honest, in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, the body politic has totally failed. It is not pluralistic, it does not share power. ISIS is saying the Sunnis are the victims of this, and that we have your back. We provide you with a support network that a political system doesn't do. Now, I cannot see where that is going to be fixed. That is the key issue. Look all around the region. The chaos that you described, Barry, is significant. 100 years since Sykes-Picot in May, and I think it's very obvious that the post-Ottoman order, certainly around the Levant and into Iraq, is decaying, and it cannot be put back together. Now, you spoke also about the US president's projection of power. There's no denying that this has been fundamentally different over the last 3 years, and that the way that President Obama has chosen to project himself, which is taking a back seat and trying to usher people along bilaterally from behind, in the eyes of his allies, has not worked. This has been a significant variable to introduce into such a conflict at such a volatile time. And I really do think that has been a massive driver of the discontent in many ways. On two levels, just to speak of quickly. It's given the message to ISIS and to ISIS leaders that America doesn't want to play anymore, and therefore we may have their measure. But just as significantly, it's given the message to allies, in particular Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, that the pivot towards Iran is a strategic pivot. It's underpinned by the values of the administration and of the US, and you guys don't like us anymore, so we have to get out there and be more muscular. That is significant. It's at such a volatile time that really introduces a variable that is going to be very difficult to manage.
I mean, I somewhat flippantly sometimes say that it's difficult to know sometimes where ISIS conspiracy theory ends and U.S. foreign policy begins, right? Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's first Ramadan sermon in 2004, who did he mention as the key enemies of the world? Well, obviously, ISIS is ranged against all enemies, right? It's a global conspiracy. But the driving mechanism of that conspiracy are three: the United States, Russia, and Iran. And he's declared war on all three at the same time. And Zarqawi, and he's on record saying this through intercepted communiques, Zarqawi thought that the Bush administration blundered into Iraq and accidentally handed this country this sort of, this Rosetta Stone of Sunni Islamic glory to Iran and to the Shia. Again, he's pathologically anti-Shia. He wanted to commit genocide against all of them. Now, ISIS thinks it wasn't an accident after all, that this was part of a grand strategy. And what do they point to? Well, I mentioned earlier, the radicalization of Iraqi Shia and the militiaization of Iraq's security services. I mean, right now you have an Iranian deep state in three major countries of the Middle East. One that Martin lives in, Syria, which has essentially propped up the Assad regime and has led the fight to retake or at least encircle the opposition stronghold in Aleppo city, and in Iraq, where it's now got to such a degree that Iraqi Shia nationalists are trying to push back forcefully against what they perceive as Iranian hegemony. And I'm astounded, I'm sure Martin and others who've covered the Iraq War, that Muqtada al-Sadr has positioned himself as this great Iraqi nationalist when this was one of the henchmen of the IRGC. But what do they see? What do Sunnis see? Forget about the ISIS command structure. They see Brett McGurk, the envoy of the coalition, going to northern Syria and meeting with the YPG Kurdish militias, which ISIS is very smart about U.S. policy contradictions and the contradictions and vulnerabilities inherent in this coalition. If you look at the worst attacks that they have committed, or the most frequent attacks they've committed, they're against who? Outside of their so-called caliphate zone. Turkey. And who are the targets that they're going after in Turkey? Kurdish rallies, Kurdish events, all linked in some political fashion to the PKK. The PKK is the Kurdish Workers' Party, a US-designated, Turkish-designated, EU-designated terrorist organization. And despite what any legal State Department fiction you may have heard, they are absolutely 100% controlling the Kurdish militias in Syria. It's a sister party, an affiliate organization, but actually a guy from the Atlantic Council who's a Turkish scholar has shown 40% of the YPG militiamen are actually PKK Turks coming across across the border to defend the Kurdish statelet of Rojava. The unintended consequence of the coalition is leading to this proliferation of competitive sectarian nationalisms in the region. And I met with a senator who sits on the Intelligence Committee, and I said, do you guys understand the genie that you're letting out of the bottle, and do you have a plan B? And he said to me, no, meaning they don't have a plan B, and they understand that there's going to be long-term consequences. So ISIS is saying, look, the Americans, they partner with the secular Marxist Kurds. It's not an anti-Kurdish agenda, by the way. There are a lot of Kurdish Islamists who have joined ISIS, and ISIS makes a big media spectacle of highlighting them. And then they show the U.S. ambassador of Iraq meeting with Hadi al-Amiri, the commander of the Badr Corps, which is responsible for fighting the Americans, running Shia death squads, killing Sunnis, dispossessing Sunnis, doing ethnic cleansing in Iraq, and offering to give U.S. Air Force support to Shia militia offensives in Iraq. Of course, plausibly denied by CENTCOM. But there's no doubt, I mean, the militias, the IRGC-controlled proxies have so honeycombed themselves within the Iraqi state structures that you cannot really separate the state from this phenomenon. ISIS points to all of this. I mean, again, it's an aggregation of pieces of evidence. And they say, look, instead of thinking that the great American imperial superpower is incompetent or inept, they have a plan, they have a strategy. And I have to say, I mean, I alluded to this Jeffrey Goldberg interview, which is the talk of the town here. If you listen to what the president says, it's not so far removed from the reality. And as Martin said, I mean, there is a perception broadly shared amongst Sunnis at levels of government in the Gulf Arab states, but also just on the ground in the shisha bars of Antakya and the souks of Cairo, that America has had it with the Sunnis. They've had it with the Gulfis, and they want to do a deal with Iran. And as awful as Qasem Soleimani may be and Hassan Nasrallah may be, these guys get things done. They're good counter-terrorists, they're good counterinsurgents, and maybe they can be the new janissaries of a regional order just before the United States flicks off the light switch and packs it up and leaves. And that is music to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's ears.
Interesting. I want to turn next to what should we do about it. If you have thoughts or questions to join the conversation, please raise your hand and I'll come towards you. But I also want to hear Jade. I threw all that stuff in the mixer, and you just heard a couple other comments. I don't know if you have further thoughts.
Those things don't really come up in my conversations. Sometimes they'll ask questions and they'll say, do you think this really happened? And I just say, I don't know. What do you think? Right? That's about it. I mean, the only other kind of influence that it does have are the people who are now members who are in Europe and the United States, who have suffered, what they perceive as, injustice, harassment, and verbal abuse that leads to them being isolated, which leaves them, going to the computer and using their skills. So they've gained quite a few members that way. But I don't think there's any specific geopolitical reason that they're doing these things, and I don't think they really impact their cyber operations, except to the extent that sometimes they will have difficulty getting internet connection, and more so recently. They say, my connection's not good. Oh, I'm so sorry.
But does that suggest that no matter what happens at the geopolitical level, that these sort of more local sort of motivations for joining the network online, at least, aren't going to go away anytime soon?
Absolutely.
Boy, that's really concerning. Okay, turn to questions now. Yes, in the middle.
How do you guys feel about... Oh, hello.
And could you identify yourself too as well?
Hi, yes, my name is Jonathan Nichols. How do you guys feel about First Amendment versus counter-propaganda, particularly as it relates to the internet? So when it comes to taking down ISIS videos or stuff, I know that, say, in Great Britain, it's illegal to have a copy of the Inspire magazine, whereas in America, I could use the Inspire magazine to present evidence of what ISIS is saying. How do we feel about First Amendment issues, freedom of speech? How do we conduct counter-propaganda operations without running into First Amendment issues?
So this gets a little bit to the what do we do about this? And here I think we're talking about at the ideological or propaganda appeal level.
It's not very difficult to find ways to obtain bits of information in the digital age. And as I say, ISIS, they like to exhibit their atrocities. The State Department runs a Twitter account, I think, called Look Again, Think Twice, or Look Away, Think... And they tweet images of, bodies in graves and, ISIS atrocity porn So if they're doing that as a way to try and dissuade people from joining, it doesn't really make sense to try to ban access to Dabik or Inspire or whatever. It also reaches these absurd degrees where, I mean, journalists who cover this stuff, analysts, think tankers, are committing a crime to try and gather information on the nature and state of mind of the enemy. Europe is a different kettle of fish. I mean, I lived in the UK for 3 years. There is no freedom of speech in the UK. I mean, truly. I just got back actually from Lithuania, where they're susceptible and feel very, this has nothing to do with ISIS, but it kind of dovetails with security and liberty. They feel completely battered and under attack by a Kremlin information warfare, similar to what we saw in Ukraine prior to the invasion. People in Lithuania think that at any moment little green men are going to come across the border. But as a signatory to the European Union, which has all kinds of statutes and covenants on free media, they have to be very careful. They can't just pull the plug on Russian television because they're saying that the Grand Duchy of Lithuania never existed. It's a Russian state. But there are certain transgressions. Ofcom, broadcasting regulations in Britain are recently finding that RT has committed all kinds of infractions. I think with ISIS, you mentioned Twitter, Facebook. These guys are very adept at finding ways around it. You take away their Skype accounts and they resort to Telegram or Signal or Viber. You pull the plug on their Facebook pages and they go to VKontakte, which is the Russian answer to Facebook. It's actually relatively easy for them to find these workaround solutions. So what's the cost-benefit ratio? What are we really preventing them from doing if we say this is against the law? I don't know.
And you're finding the same thing online when accounts are shut down on Twitter or Facebook.
Right. I guess where I stand on the First Amendment is that I never try to censor them. Right. I want to learn as much from them as possible. In the last couple of months, they've tried to, ramp up their online attacks, like they're offensive on Facebook, and they'll be like, okay, you guys, in the next 48 hours or on this day at 6 p.m. in Mosul, which, by the way, is a comedy of errors because they can't ever figure out how to set their clocks correctly. So you constantly have these guys that are like, what day are we doing this? What time? What time? It's like, come on, guys, get your shit together. So they'll say, okay, we're going to attack this article, and we're just going to write a bunch of comments, and it's going to, enrage the kuffar, and they're going to die in their rage. That's actually not illegal to do. So here they think, they're really sticking it to us with maybe like 100 comments over 2 hours. That's not illegal for them to do. I guess, how do we counter what they're doing? The things that I'm more interested in doing doesn't really have to do with counter propaganda so much as when I sort of set out on this, my goal was, okay, let's see how far we can penetrate in the different areas of their cyber domain, and let's try to get as much control over the influence that we can do, right? So I have a bit of sway in their InfoSec. Right, I have a bit of sway in all these, various different things, right? So if I can change, move them away from cybersecurity to cyber insecurity, I'm going to take this opportunity to do that, right? So it's kind of a more behind-the-scenes version of doing that because, like I said before, I don't think that it's particularly effective to put out, anti-ISIS propaganda en masse because they're not going to listen.
Additional questions, gentlemen here, if we can get a microphone to the front.
Thank you. Munjid Dawadi from the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. My question is about the ideological fight against ISIS, and you talked about they're trying to export maybe this fight somewhere else. Maybe the latest, if you can comment on the latest attacks that happened in Bingardan in the south of Tunisia, from Libya that came across the border. There was a big fight. Also about the closing of political space in the Middle East. If you could comment on that, especially on banning major political parties like in Egypt and other places.
The closing of political space is an essential issue. As I mentioned earlier, there have been attempts over the past 10 to 12 years to encourage plurality, power sharing, responsible use of power, political process. I mean, there have been times in Iraq. There was a period there in 2009, 2010, where it did look as though some kind of a democratic footing was starting to take hold. There was a fleeting moment in Lebanon as well. But I think the fundamental reality is that they didn't take root. They haven't. And we have seen a resort back to authoritarian stroke totalitarian tendencies right across the region. This is feeding the Islamic State. It's a significant driver for them on many levels, particularly apropos the disenfranchisement of the Sunnis. Now, the point that Michael made earlier about population being more significant to geography for them is exactly so, and that does play into what they are looking to do in terms of exporting their chaos far and wide. Libya matters to them not so much because of any historical connection, but because of its proximity to Rome, which is essential in a lot of the cultural discussions that go on, the religious discussions that go on in the organisation. They do see themselves as having a target on Rome. Rome, perhaps more important than anywhere else in Europe or the US. Actually, it comes up so consistently in conversations. So Rome has some ancient connotations there, apropos the Crusaders and whatever else. And the fact that they have been able to so successfully export these microcells into the Sinai, into Libya, into Yemen and elsewhere, and their eyes are a lot further into Southeast Asia now, does show how significant the strategic shift has been towards population as opposed to territory. And this is going to be a very, very difficult thing to defeat until somebody somehow can convince the Sunnis of the Arab world in particular that they are no longer on the losing side, that they do have a stake in the future of the region, and that they do have a collective voice that can re-empower them.
Any thoughts on the question? I mean, I think this is sort of it's not quite a root cause question, but it is a major issue in causing disenfranchisement. You're always going to have some of it. Well, but it strikes me when it's on a massive region-wide scale, that is a major driver of this.
The Manichaean view of us versus them is very important, and not only are they trying to put their own house in order, I suppose, but they're trying to change the electorates in Western democracies. Yeah. This is why they're perpetrating terror attacks in Paris, and if they have their druthers in Washington, New York, London, Spain, actually, a U.S. intelligence official told me, is another key point, key locus for them in their activity. That probably going to Al-Andalus and the sort of Islamic glories of yore. But yeah, they want, for instance, Marine Le Pen to be president of France, who says, close the border, no Muslims, out. This is a Christian country. When Viktor Orban gets up and says, we don't want any refugees in Hungary because this is a Christian country. There's somebody who's going like this in Raqqa and Mosul, because that's exactly what they're preaching, right? You can't trust the kuffar. They say that they believe in, this pagan religion of democracy, and they will give you your fair share. Look what they did in Egypt. They banned, the Muslim Brotherhood is elected free and fairly, and they took it away. Look what they did in Iraq and Syria and so on. So, don't underestimate their ability. And this is, again, they are geopolitical thinkers. I know that sounds ridiculous. We think of the ISIS guys as these spotty 14-year-olds from Tunisia running into do jihad and eat Nutella. Not at all. The people who are calling the shots at the upper echelons, again, they are state actors. Let me repeat that. They are state actors. They were trained up by state security services, behind them trained up by the East German Stasi or the KGB in its time. They know how to do propaganda, they know how to do disinformation, and they know how to read the weaknesses and vulnerabilities in the West. In the Cold War, these were called active measures. You start putting things into a news cycle, you start disseminating bits of falsehood and bits of disinformation such that you cleave Western allies away from each other. I mentioned Turkey. I mean, look at what's happening now in Turkey. There is a huge domestic political and, frankly, security crisis where ISIS and now the PKK are competing for blowing stuff up in the streets of Ankara and Istanbul. And the goal there is to topple the government of Erdogan, but also hold it hostage. Hold it hostage because, God forbid, they should cut the supply lines into the caliphate. Everything that ISIS has will dry up. And they know that Turkey doesn't want to be part of this war against ISIS. Turkey wants to overthrow Assad, which ISIS would then exploit by trying to take even more territory in Syria. They're crafty. It doesn't do to try and just lampoon them as a bunch of country bumpkins. False. You have to understand the nature and sophistication of your enemy if you have any hope of defeating him.
But just a quick follow-on. I mean, so if, let's say, the political process, and this is a big if, let's say the political process to resolve the Syrian conflict is successful, how big would that be for the broad battle against ISIS?
I mean, it depends on what this settlement would look like. The thing I keep hearing now muttered in the Russian foreign ministry, or even to some extent here among the foreign policy establishment, is Plan B is essentially a soft partition of Syria. Phil Gordon, who was up until recently Obama's Middle East advisor, co-wrote this article for the Rand Corporation, I believe, in which he envisaged essentially Sunnistan, Alawistan, and then the ISIS caliphate, which would be gradually shrunk under an international effort. Sunnistan is actually non-contiguous territory, one in the north around the Aleppo area, which would be controlled by the Turks, one in the south in Deraa, which would be controlled by Jordan. Alawistan would be underwritten by Russian hard power. The United States would underwrite, I forgot one, Kurdistan or Rojava in the north, because the YPG are our only ground force. And then we would all work together to somehow shrink ISIS like a tumor or a pimple. I mean, nice work if you can get it. Partitioning countries in the Middle East usually does not resolve conflicts so much as leads to the proliferation and unforeseen consequences of even further conflict. So I have very dim hopes for this settlement. And Martin and I were talking on the way over, what is Putin playing at by withdrawing or claiming to withdraw? I mean, look, I think he's achieved his very limited objectives, which were to keep the regime alive, physically so, but also to give it new political life. I mean, the idea that Assad must relinquish power as a precondition for negotiating some kind of transition, that's now off the table. And Moscow had made that sort of the sine qua non of its policy from the very beginning. The U.S. and the so-called Friends of Syria have moved closer into the Damascus, Tehran, Moscow orbit than vice versa. So you don't need to drop bombs if the U.S. is going to do your policy for you.
Just quickly, everywhere I go recently in southern Turkey or in Lebanon, and if I do run into people who have somehow made it out of Raqqa or out of ISIS territory, all of them will say that as much as we hate ISIS, we hate Assad even more. Yeah. So if there was some kind of a political solution, which at the very least, and I wouldn't say solution, a political outcome, which got rid of Assad and potentially some of the Alawite establishment there, that would be the only good news that I could see in a very bleak region. I'm not saying that would lead to a solution, but I think it would calm things down in the short to medium term.
Very interesting. General Wald, and then we'll start taking a few.
I'm Chuck Weld with Deloitte and the Atlantic Council. Martin, or all of you, what do you interpret the reason that you're allowed to have this freedom of relationship with your person? Is it you're a messenger, or he just wants to have a friend?
You know, surprisingly, it's the second. It really is. He is not speaking. He is not sanctioned by the senior leadership to come and speak to me at all. In fact, if they knew that he was doing this, he would be killed straight away, and so would all of his family. The genesis for him actually getting back with these guys was he was fighting with a regular Syrian opposition unit right throughout 2012 and 13. Was it 14? I can't recall. It was towards the end of 2013. At that time, he was summoned to Raqqa by people he was in Bucca with. He got there, and Baghdadi was sitting in the room and asked him to take up a very senior leadership position. He couldn't say no to it. I'd met him in the year or so prior, various times in southern Turkey. He came straight to me looking for somebody to talk to about this. So it did become a personal relationship, and it still is, and it's the strangest professional relationship I've ever had, in that here is a guy, ostensibly a member of the most significant terror organization in the world, who wants to befriend me and talk about things. And he comes and goes into Turkey without the Turks knowing about it. They certainly don't know he's there, and he wants to talk. So I guess what it's done is provided a window into the upper echelons of a world that I wouldn't have had any other way, and it's a relationship that I've been very careful to try and cultivate.
Jay, how's that working for you? Why are they coming to you? Why are they talking to you online?
It's a lot of the same thing. It's a lot about personal relationships. It does help that I can hack things. It does help that I do have some technical capability. But at the end of the day, that's about 20%, 10% of what I do, and the rest of it is just social engineering, right? So, you meet someone who, oh, this person, has a lot of access. This person's really interesting. You're going to be my new best friend. So we're going to talk. We're going to talk a lot, and we're going to talk about whatever you want to talk about. So if they've had a rough day or a busy day, oh, what are you up to, right? Or they'll say, you should take a look at this, right? And they'll take a screenshot or whatever. And sometimes, their PERSEC is not great. Like some of these guys really have very sophisticated skill. They'll use VPNs, they'll use proxies, they'll use anything they can to mask their thing. And then they'll give you like a phone number of a close relative of theirs that's attached to, a business, their landline. So you know exactly where they are. It's like, what's the point of all these other things, right? So, if you talk to them enough, and, I'm friendly, like I'm from North Dakota, right? So we're just going to, we're going to chat. I'm not going to be, I'm not in counterintelligence, like I'm not going to grill you on anything, but you'd be surprised at what they'll tell you when they don't think it's significant.
Very interesting. Microphone over here to Harlan Ullman, please.
I'm Harlan Ullman with the Atlantic Council. Barry, well done to you and the panel. This has been a fascinating discussion. Twain said that history rhymes, but I think it repeats. In Vietnam, it was clear if we wanted to get good information on the Viet Cong in the North, you didn't go to ARVN, you didn't go to the CIA, you went to the media, especially foreign journalists. I wondered how you would rate our government's collectively understanding of what the Islamic State is about, what you think the strengths and weaknesses are, and then second, in a political and strategic sense, what do you think we ought to be doing that we're not, and what do we think we ought to stop doing that we are doing?
So let me make that clear. Sort of report card for governments, plural, strategy and performance to date. But then what if you were advising President Obama or the next president, depending on who that is, what would you recommend? Or at least what would be the single most important thing that you would recommend in what undoubtedly would be a multi-pronged strategy? So first, how's it going? But then what would be the key to success in the future?
I mean, I think the results have been mixed, and I see often too often cheerleading masquerading as analysis. A sober assessment of the threat level, and one of the things we didn't talk about is as the caliphate contracts, they have sort of returned to their old new strategy, as I call it, of foreign operations. Zarqawi was always keen on attacking outside of Iraq. In fact, his first target technically was the Jordanian embassy, which was sovereign Jordanian, because he was Jordanian jailbird himself. And he perpetrated the Amman hotel bombings in 2005, I believe. And there was an abortive chemical weapons attack, which could have actually really done significant damage to central Amman, which was intercepted by the Jordanian intelligence. But now they're returning to form. And I think I counted at one point within the space of 3 months, they managed to hit either with agents that had been in Raqqa who were dispatched outward or radicalized remotely, 3 NATO countries in 3 months. Pretty good. Turkey, they hit the United States, and they hit France. In terms of a report card, I think part of the strategy of diverting attention elsewhere into the continent in North America is to keep the intelligence services so discombobulated and on the back foot. I mean, I mentioned Spain. And my source, who is U.S. intelligence, I said, well, do the Spanish intel people know what they're doing? And the reply I got was, no, the Europeans don't know what they're doing until 100 people get killed in the street. Now, keep in mind that's, I'm sure, a territorial issue between the Americans and the Europeans, but that blithe sense of we don't really know where it's coming next. And, yesterday's lead could be, tomorrow's dud or tomorrow's major spectacular. In terms of understanding the inner mechanisms of the organization, there are very good, capable people at all levels of government. And one of my frustrations, and I guess this grades into the next part of the answer, the people, the one you might say saving grace or takeaway from the Iraq War was we really did get to understand how that part of the world functions, the tribal politics, the anthropology, You have people who worked in the Pentagon and the Defense Intelligence Agency and in the CIA and State Department who can tell you, I mean, paint a kind of mental landscape, village by village, hamlet by hamlet, who the sort of the leadership councils of these communities are, the plurality, the division between Sunni, Shia, Kurd, Turkmen, whatever. And I mean, I know them because I interviewed them for my book, and the reason they were able to speak so forthrightly is nobody's really talking to them in this administration. They've kind of been shunted aside. And I mean, I've been very critical of the government's policy just writ large. Before ISIS, it was the Syria policy, as Martin said. That revolution really gave them newfound accelerant in terms of their state-building capability. And right now, I've alluded, what we're doing, the forces we are unleashing, perhaps accidentally, perhaps not, are feeding their overarching narrative. What would I do differently? You have to, in some manner, and I'm not a military strategist, and I'm not, kind of wargaming this, but you have to, in some manner, engage the Assad regime, and at least offer protection to Sunni Arabs in particular, in Syria. And, what we've limited ourselves to doing are, Samantha Power tweeting denunciations of Bashar al-Assad or John Kerry comparing him to Hitler. All well and good, but if it's not backed by fire and steel, it's meaningless. So really, the hearts and minds cliche, it starts with offering the safe haven and protection to the bellwether constituency of ISIS's caliphate.
Jade, what's your thought on that?
Well, in the cyber domain, I think that, I guess in other domains, there are some very, very capable people and very, very capable departments that you never hear anything about because, they're focused on what's the next threat, what are people talking about, and how do we stop them. And this is both on social media and also, in the hacking world. And I think that they're doing a terrific job, and I don't think that they get the recognition that they deserve. So if you're out there, thank you. One of the things that I would like to see, and I don't know how feasible it is, but a lot of times, ISIS will put out, all their links. They'll put out links to Facebook, to Tumblr, to Archive, all these things. And so you know exactly what screen name, what usernames they're using, where they want people to go, where they're planning to attack, blah, 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 all these things, right? And so we hear a lot about, Silicon Valley working with the government. But we don't really hear a lot about the companies working together. Because if you had people from Telegram communicating with people from Facebook and Twitter, you would be a lot more effective in shutting these guys down much faster. And the other point that I would like to bring up is the issue of authorizations, right? So obviously, there are things that I'm allowed to do, and there are things that I'm not allowed to do. And some of the things that I would like to be able to do, you have to, they're not terribly damaging, but it takes a long time to get an authorization for it. But in reality, you have about 30 minutes before, you can only stall these guys so long. So they say, either you're in or you're out, right? And if you're out too many times, they're going to get suspicious, right? So unless you can find a way to spin these things, and I'm not talking about just me, I'm talking about anybody who deals with these issues on a regular basis, because there has to be a faster way to do this. Obviously, I'm not going to be a proponent of providing material support to terrorism, and I don't think that authorization should come so easily, but I think there has to be a faster, less bureaucratic way to go about that.
Martin, what are your thoughts?
So I think over the last 8 years in particular, I've had a lot to do with very senior members of the US administration and the administration in the UK, and also, I guess, less public cogs in the wheel. And I must say that there are some extremely capable Americans that I've met in the field, who are technically capable, who understand the anthropology, who get the key drivers of the society. But I don't think that their knowledge has collectively distilled right on through to policy making, not in the UK and not here either. And I think even 13 years after the invasion of Baghdad, we don't fully understand the anthropology of the Middle East and how that can and how that should drive decision making. So I think that remains a fundamental criticism, notwithstanding the very significant efforts and contributions of a lot of good people. Where to from here? The Sunni disenfranchisement is something you just cannot set aside. At the grassroots level, if you look at the Sunnis of Syria, Iraq and Lebanon, they absolutely have, by any objective test, suffered at the hands of Iranian-led administrations or regimes in all of those three countries. If you feed into that the US's traditional allies, Saudi Arabia in the Gulf, also feeling disenfranchised, and them being the natural constituents of people who are already offside, then that is not going to end anywhere good at any time soon. So I would strongly argue for a recalibration of administration thinking here. This pivot towards Iran is not going to bring peace to the region. It simply won't. If there was a more nuanced way of sharing power, or a better way of messaging core allies, and the US, rightly or wrongly, has underwritten the regional security order for the last 70 years. To walk away now at such a volatile time is not going to do anything other than feed this conflict for a long time to come. So I think that there needs to be a rethink about that, and there needs to be a rethink very, very quickly. Let's not pretend that's going to lead to any sort of democracy at any point, anytime soon. The lessons of the Arab revolutions have showed that those spasms we saw of democratic leanings were very quickly overwhelmed, and that's going to be the case for a long time to come. So I think we need to get things back onto at least a semi-stable footing before we can start to talk about solutions.
Great, thank you. Microphone to the second row here, please.
Hi, my name is Mona Alami. I am a non-resident fellow with the Rafi Hariri Center. My question is to Michael. You were talking about ISIS welfare state, and I totally agree. My question is in recent weeks, we've seen that the situation has dramatically declined in Mosul. My sources tell me there is very little food, very little access to medication. We've seen in Fallujah there was an insurrection, clashes between different tribes with the Hasba. We've seen tribes shooting at ISIS and hits. We've even seen an attack in Abu Ghraib by ISIS that we think was motivated by ISIS wanted to access the wheat silos in Baghdad. So what does this say about the capacity of ISIS to provide for its people, and how does this translate in the war on ISIS, and what can the Iraqi government do to exploit this weakness that we're seeing now, witnessing now?
It's an excellent. It's an excellent question. To be honest with you, it is true that ISIS's budgets, coffers have been straightened by the war, the infrastructure, the destruction of the hydrocarbon industry, the loss of terrain, and thereby, a reduction in taxation collection. But they still have enough, I think, that you are going to see these pockets of hot conflicts. It's certainly the case Sunni tribes have partnered in some cases with Hashd al-Shabi and the Iraqi government in the retaking of Ramadi, for instance. But I have yet to see this transform into a real grassroots-style counterinsurgency. And the reason being, it's again going back to this carrot and stick approach. People under exigent circumstances are linking up with ISIS faute de mieux, because they don't see a credible alternative. They don't necessarily want to be liberated by the Iraqi government because ISIS is telling them, and not without some basis in reality, if the Iraqi army or if the Hashd come into the village, you're going to be counted as a collaborator, because guess what? You're a member of ISIS. So your house is going to be razed to the ground, your children will be taken away to some dungeon and tortured. This is a terrifying kind of minatory approach to population control. I haven't studied in depth what's taking place in Mosul lately. I wouldn't be surprised if there are going to be protests. There is some covert resistance, right? Let's not claim that everybody is sort of pro-ISIS or just staying pacific. You see it in Raqqa. Raqqa is being slaughtered silently. The civic rights / monitor organization, which won the press award in New York recently. They daily produce content, Samizdat-style footage and evidence of what ISIS is getting up to. But ISIS is, again, very good at suppressing dissent. They've trailed the Raqqa guys into Turkey and assassinated them there. They're going to do the same in Mosul. There's another unspoken sort of dynamic here. The Iraqi government is committed to extirpating ISIS. But this is the Middle East. Everybody cuts a deal at some point, yeah? And when you see tribal sheikhs being sent from Nineveh to reconciliation conferences in Baghdad, now, they're not paid-up members of ISIS, but they are emissaries on behalf of sectors of the caliphate. There's negotiations taking place. A guy who works in the Iraqi mission to the UN in New York a year ago, and this is not a low-level official, told me, I wouldn't be surprised if tomorrow there's some kind of power-sharing arrangement, or ISIS withdraws from a certain part or certain quadrants of Mosul in exchange for X, Y, and Z. I said, really? He said, Habibi, welcome to Iraq. So this is another, and again, who are these guys and where do they come from? They have been occupying the country for decades. They did it under Saddam. All of those underground networks, that smuggled weapons and drugs and cars, even they partnered with al-Duri for a reason, because he was the guy responsible for this. Mm-hmm. They know this country intimately well, much better than we do. And I think that's been the chief benefit for their occupation regime, if you like.
Mm-hmm. I think we have time for one more question, right there.
I guess my question is, the rhetoric...
Can you hold for the microphone and identify yourself, please?
My name is Paul Sukar. I guess my question is, there was a rhetoric in the region at some point that the U.S. Foreign policy machine didn't really understand the region under Rumsfeld and the Bush administration. And this administration only continued on that to show that they have zero understanding of how the region works, allowing, even at times when you started to counter that with like U.S. troops, let's say, cooperating with Sahwa groups in Iraq, or you reached a point where, like, the U.S. showed that they have, maybe zero understanding of what's happening in the region, like all of you mentioned earlier. But despite all this rhetoric, because the U.S. was on both sides, let's say, it was the aggressor at some point, now it's helping the Shiites, it's helping the Alawites, is there no reason to believe that there is a fundamental problem in the Ibn Taymiyyah and everything that had to do with the Islamic teaching that those people are teaching right now to their people? Because regardless of who the aggressor is or how the aggressor is going to act, they will always label someone as infidel. And this doesn't show that the problem is on the other part, but on their part itself. My second question is, why do you think partitioning is something that is so bad? The artificial borders that were drawn by Sykes-Picot after World War I were artificial borders combining people together that never lived together or never wanted to be together. And one of the examples is Yemen. When Yemen was divided between the north and the south, everything was working fine. Combining them together, everything was screwed up. So why do you think that is a bad idea in the region?
I'll take the second. I'll take the partition.
You want to take the partition?
Yeah.
Okay. So with respect to the U.S. not knowing sort of its ass from its elbow in the Middle East, I think this has been kind of a big leitmotif of this discussion. That said, and here, in all fairness to Barack Obama and whoever succeeds him, well, within limits, of course, there's only so much this country can do. Yeah, and I quite agree, and this dovetails to your next point. The teachings of Ibn Taymiyyah, the revivification of the Islamic revival period, or the original awakening actually, and how it's been used as a method of indoctrination and essentially the ideological brainwashing of whole populations throughout the region. That's absolutely a core problem and a major driver behind ISIS. In our book, we delve into some of the ideology and the borrowings, not even just from going back to the medieval period, but the Kutubis and the Brotherhood, and how Salafism and Brotherhood ideology were sort of merged at one point, particularly in Egypt, but also in the Gulf states. And this stuff is now being kind of regurgitated in the Levant and Mesopotamia. But, and here is where I kind of break with the problem is Islam. There's a political, pragmatic underlay to all of this, right? It's what I call Sunni restorationism or Sunni revanchism. I don't think Ibn Taymiyyah, I don't think ISIS Sharia, which by the way is being invented by ISIS all the time. I don't think that's necessarily the reason that kind of this state of affairs exists. Before Islamism, before Salafi jihadism or takfirism as a real going concern, you had other competing ideologies. You had Baathism, for Christ's sakes. You had pan-Arab nationalism. It's a matter of who is seen to be the dominant power, who is seen to be actually winning the war for hearts and minds, controlling populations, controlling the riches and lost glories of ancient civilization. And right now, ISIS is succeeding. But again, I think it's much more to do with the geopolitics and sort of the exigencies of war. Both Iraq and Syria, Syria for a half decade, Iraq for now a decade and a half almost, have been in a state of war. And wars do things to people. They radicalize populations. The definition of to brutalize is to turn someone into a brute. It's not to treat them in a brutal manner. This is what's happening all the time. And I think that, if you took Islam out of the equation, you would still have ISIS, believe it or not. It's just, the marketing would be different.
So just on the issue of partition, I actually think it needs to be part of the discussion. Geopolitically, globally, there are reasons for it not to be, because if we talked about even a federalism in Iraq or Syria or Lebanon, that is going to have a domino effect well beyond to Turkey, to Iran, to Saudi Arabia, to Jordan. We think we have problems now in the Middle East. Wait till we start doing that. So that's going to roll on for decades longer. But nonetheless, I think that that we have to acknowledge, we have to face up to the fact that Iraq is a failed state. And it will continue. It's not going to be put back together. Syria, Lebanon. I mean, they're not far behind, if they're behind at all. I think facing up to things as they are, rather than dealing with them as we wish they would be, would be a significant step. But notwithstanding the geopolitical pressures on doing that.
Jade, I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that last issue. Well, I'm really upset that we're out of time. I can't think of a better, richer discussion on this topic that I've been privy to. So please join me in thanking our fantastic panelists.